of Charles Darwin. Next, he talks about Darwin's theory of evolution in his book, Trials of the Monkey, an Accidental Memoir.
It is.
Oh, in Tennessee, and you are the person to see today.
No, really?
Good afternoon. I'm Sandy Brewer, and on behalf of the Humanities Tennessee, I'd like to welcome you to the Southern Festival of Arts, or excuse me, the Southern Festival of Books, and the Trial of the Monkey session. The signing of the books will follow afterwards at the signing colonnade, and Mr. Chapman will be there to sign any book that you would like to have signed. Matthew Chapman was born in Cambridge, England, and is the great-grandson of Charles Darwin. He has written and directed 5 films. He has and lived for many years in Los Angeles. He's a Hollywood screenwriter, and he now lives in Manhattan. Trials of the Monkey is his first book. Mr. Chapman.
Thank you. Never done this before, so it's liable to be a little disorganized. The book originally was supposed to really be 2 strands. I was going to retell the story of the Scopes monkey trial, but also go down and visit the town where it took place and see how it was in the latter half of the 20th century. But it turned a 3rd strand came into the book. So if you get a little bit lost because there's so many different elements to the book, don't worry. If you read the book, you'll understand. In the spring of 1998, Tom Headley, publisher of Duckworth, invited me to write a book. He had read a screenplay of mine and felt I could handle something larger. I decided I'd like to write about the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, the trial of a schoolteacher accused of teaching evolution in defiance of Tennessee law. This was not an arbitrary choice. My great-great-grandfather was Charles Darwin, something I had given little thought to as an adult until I came to America and discovered his theories were still rabidly contested. A recent Gallup poll found that 40% of those surveyed favored teaching creationism instead of evolution in public schools. And as everybody knows, in 1999, the Kansas Board of Education voted to delete virtually every mention of evolution from the state's science curriculum. I suggested to Tom that I should take a Greyhound bus from New York, where I live, down to Dayton, Tennessee, the small town where the trial took place. Apart from doing historical research, I would also find out what had changed in the town in the past 75 years, if anything. I had heard that once a year the town staged a reenactment of the trial. I would cover the event, the largest in the town's calendar, and this would become the hub from which I'd throw out the other spokes of the intended work. People generally believe they are part of an evolutionary process, either physical, spiritual, or both. At an absolute minimum, they note with smug satisfaction how much taller and smarter and richer they are than their forefathers. This suggests that life is, if not meaningful, at least progressive. But how could any of these assumptions work for me? What was the likelihood of my evolving beyond Grandpa? Even physically, I turned out to be a lesser man. Born in 1809, he grew to be 6 feet tall. Born in 1950, I barely made 5'10". I not only got the short end of the stick, I was the short end of the stick. When Darwin called his second book The Descent of Man instead of The Ascent of Man, he was clearly thinking of his progeny. One only has to study the chronology to see the truth of this. First there was Charles Darwin, 2 yards long and nobody's fool. Then there was his son, my great-grandfather, Sir Francis Darwin, an eminent botanist. Then came my grandmother, Frances, a modest poet who spent a considerable amount of time in rest homes for depression. From her issued my beloved mother, Claire, who was extremely short, failed to complete medical school, and eventually became an alcoholic. Then we get down to me. I'm in the movie business. So sometimes you see things go backwards. I'm an example of a regressed creature. I regress towards the mean, it's called. However, by some genetic fluke, I retained enough of Darwin's powers of observation to be able to see clearly which way I was heading. My boyhood hero was Curious George the monkey, and when I was taken to the zoo at the age of 6 and saw live monkeys picking and scratching exactly as I did, and trying to have sex in public, I was convinced evolution was a yo-yo, and in my case the yo-yo had just about reached the end of the string. All I had to do was push it down another inch or two and it would rise again. If Charles was the top, I would be the bottom. If he was the beginning, I would be the end. Simple academic mediocrity would not suffice. I had to do worse than that. I had to fight education with everything I had. As stubborn and diligent as Charles was in collecting facts, so I would be in holding them at bay. If this was my defense against the crushing weight of family history, and if the strategy ultimately failed, you certainly couldn't fault me for its execution on the ground. I emerged from school with an outstanding lack of knowledge. 30 years later, I am on a Greyhound bus heading south to Dayton, Tennessee, the small town where in 1925 schoolteacher John Scopes was prosecuted for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. The first trial ever to be broadcast live by radio not only to America but also to Europe and Australia. It was given the title The Trial of the Century, and for my money it remains so. A philosophical skirmish between religion and reason, between the most famous fundamentalist of his day, William Jennings Bryan, and the most famous humanist, Clarence Darrow. It was played out in an atmosphere of hucksterism and commerce, uniquely and hilariously American. I'm going to see what has changed in the town since 1925, if anything. I want to find out if they still believe the world was made in 6 days and is only 6,000 years old. It seems incredible that they might believe such a thing, but word has it they do. Every year the town stages a reenactment of the trial. As the trial lasted for several days, and as the outcome was not entirely favorable to the fundamentalists, who still dominate the region, I'm intrigued to see what gets lost in the editing. I'm going down now, a month in advance of the show, to do some research, and will then return for the play in July. My idea, although it's not fully formed yet, is to spin the whole book out from the play. But as I traveled down on the bus, I began to think about my life. In my struggle for survival, I have dragged my simian arse as far from its origins as I could, from the clipped lawns of Cambridge, England, to the Mercedes-littered lots of Hollywood, then on to New York's Upper East Side. And all I've achieved spiritually is that, survival. Somewhere in my mind there still swaggers the fine young atheistic monkey of my youth. But suddenly it's no longer amusing or effective, and soon it will become embarrassing. I am not afraid of death. I'm afraid of a moment when, immobilized by something fatal, and unable to distract myself with work or sex or illusions of progress, I reflect on my life and see a rich and fascinating landscape, and me off to one side of it, a rat inside a wheel of darkness. I feel like an adolescent lobbed into middle age without the necessary equipment, and now, sitting in the bus, cut loose from obligation and decency, I start to wonder why. When I look out the bus window, what I now see are scenes from my childhood, and I find myself compelled to write them down. Another book, an unasked-for book, takes shape in my mind, an accidental memoir. I did inherit one other thing from Darwin, apart from the vestiges of his observational skills and a tendency to hypochondria, a genuine case of eczema. For him, it lasted all his life. I managed to shake mine soon after I had sex for the first time. Coincidental. However, from infancy to the other side of puberty, some part of my body was always experiencing the itch. There was never a time when an outpost of the disease was not established somewhere, and every month or so, as if creeping from a grate, the disease would emerge and blossom forth. Usually it would take possession of my hands first, around the knuckles and between the fingers,